January 14th, 1973. Hours earlier, the world had seen him like never before. Aloha from Hawaii via satellite. The first concert broadcast live across the globe. The stage lights were gone now, replaced by the muted glow of an airport gate. He boarded slowly, as if each step still carried the echo of thousands of clapping hands. It was a regular commercial flight, but the air felt different. Too many faces had recognized him the moment he stepped inside. The murmurs grew until a flight attendant, half smiling, locked eyes with him and said loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear, "So, are you really Elvis? Or just another guy in a shiny jumpsuit?" The aisle rippled with laughter. Passengers leaned forward for a better look. Someone raised a camera. He stood there holding a white jacket, saying nothing. Seconds passed, longer than anyone expected. The laughter faltered. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried through the cabin. "I am. But today, maybe I'm more myself than I was on that stage." The stillness that followed was different from the earlier hush before takeoff. This one was heavier, sharper, the kind of silence that meant people were seeing him in a way they hadn't before. And from that moment, the flight was no longer just a flight. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The aisle was still crowded with passengers shifting bags and jackets when he stepped forward, moving with a quiet certainty that seemed at odds with the bustle around him. His boots made a muted tap against the narrow floor, each step steady, deliberate. The flight attendant at the door glanced up, recognized him instantly, and her smile wavered between polite professionalism and something more knowing. He gave a small nod, not breaking stride. He reached the first row, dropped into the aisle seat, and placed his jacket beside him in the empty spot. Soft leather, creased at the elbows, carrying the faint scent of cologne and stage lights. Behind him, fragments of conversation flickered like half-heard radio static, a man's chuckle, a woman's whisper, the scratch of a boarding pass being tucked into a purse. The smell of jet fuel seeped faintly into the cabin, mingling with the scent of freshly cleaned upholstery. Outside the window, the airport lights smeared into streaks of gold and amber, trembling slightly with each vibration of the idling engines. He watched them for a long moment, his reflection faint against the glass, the profile familiar to millions, but here reduced to the simple curve of a jaw, a shadowed brow, a stillness that seemed almost defensive. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and efficient, announcing the final checks before takeoff. The seatbelt light chimed on. He leaned back into the leather seat, posture relaxed, but his right hand tapped an irregular rhythm on the armrest. Not to any melody, just a restless beat. There was no anger in his face, only a thoughtful heaviness, the residue of a moment earlier in the boarding gate when laughter had turned into something sharper, a ripple of mockery he'd chosen not to acknowledge. It wasn't insult that clung to him now, it was something quieter, heavier, the realization that for some he existed only as the figure in rhinestones, the exaggerated silhouette under the stage lights, not the man who sat here in worn denim with sleep still clinging to him. A soft shuffle of shoes approached from the galley. The same attendant who had met him at the door now stood by his seat, tray balanced easily in one hand. Her smile was small, but edged with a trace of mischief. "Coffee, Mr. Presley?" she asked, the tone light, but with a glint of irony she didn't bother to hide. "Or perhaps something a little more royal." He turned his head to her, his eyes calm, and the corner of his mouth lifted, not in sarcasm but in a gentler, almost tired humor. "Coffee," he said. "Black. Even kings wake up tired." There was a stifled laugh from somewhere 2 rows back. He didn't glance in that direction. As she began to turn, he added, still looking out the window, "Sometimes coffee matters more than a crown." It wasn't loud, but the sentence landed with a quiet finality. The space behind him seemed to shift. Whispers died mid-breath. The chuckles lost their edge. She hesitated, nodded once without the teasing smile, and moved down the aisle. Somewhere nearby, a man stopped speaking mid-story. The air between rows subtly rebalanced. The hum of the air system filled the pause, blending with the low growl of the engines. He stayed facing the glass, letting his gaze rest on the slow, mechanical dance outside. A baggage cart trundling past, a wingtip light blinking in measured intervals, the thin vapor rising off the tarmac in the night air. In his mind, the contrast was stark. The roaring chaos of a stage, the blinding white of spotlights, the flood of applause that could feel like a tidal wave. And here, this moment. No music, no microphone, no distance between himself and the world around him. The engine's pitch deepened. The cabin tilted almost imperceptibly as the aircraft began its roll toward the runway. He let his head rest back, closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and listened to the sound of it all. The murmured conversations now gentler, the click of a seatbelt fastening, the faint chime of a call button far down the aisle. When he opened his eyes again, the streaks of light outside had begun to stretch into longer ribbons, as if the night itself was ready to be pulled away from the ground. Somewhere in that motion, he felt a small shift inside. Not a lifting of mood, exactly, but the recognition that tonight, at least, he had kept part of himself intact. The seat beside him remained empty. His jacket lay there like an unspoken barrier, soft and unthreatening, but enough to keep the space his own. As the engines roared into their climb, the voices behind him faded further, replaced by the deep, steady vibration of flight. He let the sound carry him upward, away from the ground where costumes and crowns mattered more than coffee, into a space where, for a few quiet minutes, he could simply be a man on a journey, looking out into the night. The landing was smooth, the tires touching down with a muted thud that rippled through the cabin. As the engines reversed, the familiar pull against his chest eased. He remained seated while others sprang to their feet, reaching for overhead compartments, shuffling jackets and carry-ons in a low storm of impatience. He preferred to wait until the aisle cleared. The extra minutes meant nothing to him, and it kept him from becoming a slow-moving obstacle in the middle of the aisle while people stared. When he finally stood, he took the jacket from the seat beside him, slung it over his arm, and moved down the aisle with an unhurried pace. A few passengers glanced his way, some with polite nods, others with the faint shimmer of recognition in their eyes. But he kept his gaze ahead. The exit was bright with terminal light. Outside the jet bridge, a handful of people had already gathered near the gate. Most were travelers, bent over tickets or phones, but off to one side, near a row of worn plastic chairs, stood an older man in a faded windbreaker. His hair was the color of paper left too long in the sun, and the curve of his spine hinted at years of hard work. A battered leather bag hung from one shoulder, and his free hand gripped a metal cane polished smooth where his fingers wrapped it. The man's eyes found him instantly, lighting up with a mixture of disbelief and triumph. He didn't push forward. He simply stood there, as if willing the moment not to rush past too quickly. He altered his path without hesitation. The crowd's background hum shifted. People noticed the change in his stride. When he reached the man, he lowered himself onto one knee. A deliberate act, not hurried, until they were eye level. "How'd you make it here?" he asked, his voice low enough to be private. The man's answer came haltingly. 2 buses from a small town, a layover, then the final connection. The trip had taken nearly a day. He'd done it because he had never seen him in person, only heard the music through a tinny radio speaker in a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and strong coffee. Without breaking eye contact, he reached to the chain around his neck. From beneath his shirt, he drew a small gold charm, a lightning bolt and the letters TCB, the emblem he'd given only to a few. He slipped it into the man's palm, folding the fingers gently over it. "Take care of business," he said softly. "Yours. Every day." The man's eyes shone wet. A murmur spread behind them as those watching began to understand what had happened. Applause rose, not the explosive kind from a stage, but the warmer, unpolished sound of genuine appreciation. A pair of airport staff approached, offering to escort him to the VIP lounge. He accepted the gesture with a nod, but before moving on, he placed a hand lightly on the man's shoulder. It lingered there just long enough for the older man to feel the steady warmth through the fabric of his jacket. The lounge was quiet, filled with the muted clink of glasses and the rustle of newspapers. A spread of food waited on linen-covered tables. But he didn't stop. Instead, he crossed to where a different flight attendant, not the one who'd tested his patience earlier, stood checking a manifest. She looked up, surprised at his direct approach. Without saying a word, he drew her into a brief embrace. It wasn't theatrical. His arms were firm, but the contact was gentle, almost protective. She froze for a fraction of a second. Then her breath hitched. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly, as if refusing to let the tears spill in front of her colleagues. From somewhere in the room, a voice whispered his name. Not shouted, just spoken with a quiet reverence. He didn't acknowledge it, keeping his attention on the woman in his arms. When he let her go, there was a new lightness in her face, as though some private burden had shifted. A security escort waited by the door. As they began to move toward the private exit, he glanced back toward the concourse. Through the glass wall, he could see the older man still seated in the plastic chair, studying the gold emblem in his hand, as though it were more than metal. Around him, travelers passed without knowing the value of what he held. The hallway to the private exit was narrow, lined with muted advertisements for destinations he had visited 100 times. The security man made a polite comment about the crowd's reaction, but he only smiled faintly. In his mind, the applause at the gate wasn't for a star walking through an airport. It was for the recognition of something human, something unadorned. In the elevator to the car waiting below, the glass charm was still missing from his own chain. The weight around his neck felt lighter, but in a way that brought no loss. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain on the far edge of the city. Somewhere out there, the man with the cane would be making his slow way home, carrying a piece of him not meant for display cases or collectors, something personal, given freely, without cameras, without ceremony. As the car door closed, he leaned back into the seat. For a moment, the image of the man's weathered hands stayed vivid in his mind. And in that image, he felt the strange, quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the truest connection happened far from the noise, in the quiet space between strangers who suddenly weren't strangers at all. The hotel suite was hushed when he returned. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting a soft amber light over the patterned carpet. He shrugged off his jacket and laid it neatly over the arm of a chair, as if preserving some unspoken order in the space. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and the citrus cleaner housekeeping had used earlier. He loosened the collar of his shirt, letting his shoulders drop for the first time since the flight. He picked up the phone and ordered hot tea. No lemon, just honey. The request was simple, but it carried a comfort he needed more than food. As he waited, he drifted to the window. From the 22nd floor, the city stretched out in blurred constellations of street lamps and traffic signals. The rain had begun again, drawing thin silver streaks down the glass. His mind wandered backward, unprompted, to a day years earlier. It wasn't a stage memory, not a headline moment. He had been leaving a small-town venue after a modest show, the kind booked early in his career. Outside the back door, he spotted a man sitting alone at the edge of the lot. A schoolteacher he recognized from his childhood. The man's clothes were modest, his shoes worn, but his eyes were bright. He had driven hours to see him perform, and afterward had nowhere to go until the morning bus. Without hesitation, he had taken him into a diner down the road and paid for their meals. No cameras, no fanfare, just two people at a corner booth, the coffee between them steaming in the yellow light. A soft knock at the door brought him back. Room service wheeled in a tray, the porcelain teapot releasing a fragrant curl of steam. He thanked the attendant and poured slowly, watching the amber liquid swirl into the cup. His hands, still warm from holding the pot, curved around the porcelain for a moment before he lifted it to his lips. The tea's heat grounded him, but the memory trail didn't end. Another scene surfaced, this one from the road, long after fame had taken root. The tour bus had broken down outside a small airport, stranding the crew between connections. Instead of calling for a catered solution, he'd slipped away to a diner across from the terminal. The place smelled of fried eggs and diesel from the trucks parked outside. He'd ordered meals for every member of the team, paying in cash and leaving before anyone could recognize him. By the time the food arrived at the airport lounge, no one knew who had made it happen. That anonymity had been part of the gift. He set the cup down, the porcelain making a faint tap against the saucer. The warmth seeped into his fingertips. From somewhere deeper in memory, another voice rose, his old karate instructor. They had trained together for years, and the man once told a story to friends about him. He never struck first, but he'd step in front of someone who needed protecting without a second thought. The instructor had recalled a day when a group of older boys was cornering a thin, nervous teenager behind a gym. He had walked straight into the middle of it, hands low, voice steady. "I'll take you on," he'd said, making it clear the fight would have to go through him. It hadn't. The boys scattered, muttering, and he'd walked the kid home without another word about it. The tea was cooling, but he didn't drink again right away. His thumb traced the rim of the cup absent-mindedly, as though keeping time with the slow rhythm of recollection. The contrast between those moments and the stage was always stark in his mind. Under the lights, the noise swelled. The crowd fed on the image, the jumpsuits, the flash. Offstage, the acts that meant the most were small, unrecorded, invisible to all but the handful who experienced them. Outside, a siren passed in the distance, its wail rising and fading against the wet streets. He stood, carrying the cup to the window, and looked down at the city again. Somewhere out there, people were meeting in diners, walking home in the rain, holding doors open for strangers. None of it would make the papers, but it was the kind of thing that actually stitched the world together. He took a final sip, now lukewarm, and set the cup aside. The quiet in the room was complete again, but inside, the weight of those remembered moments lingered. Not heavy, not burdensome, but present. A reminder that the parts of him that mattered most had nothing to do with spotlights or set lists. In that stillness, he realized the tea wasn't just for warmth. It was a tether, something that kept him connected to the man who once bought a teacher dinner, fed a stranded crew, stood between a boy and his attackers. That man still lived here, in this quiet room above the rain-lit city, waiting for the next small moment that might matter to someone more than they'd ever be able to say. The tarmac glistened under the lights, a thin sheen of moisture catching every gold and silver reflection from the terminal. The Lisa Marie waited just beyond the service trucks, her nose angled slightly toward the runway as if impatient to be moving. The fuselage gleamed under the floodlights, a private world wrapped in polished paint and quiet luxury. He stepped from the car into the scent of aviation fuel and damp asphalt, the night air cool enough to raise the small hairs on his arms. The stairs to the plane were slick, each step ringing faintly under his boots. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, the air carrying a faint note of leather, polished wood, and the delicate trace of a woman's perfume that lingered from an earlier flight. The seating was laid out not like a commercial plane, but like a living room suspended in the air. Wide leather chairs, wood-paneled walls, gold-toned seat-belt buckles catching the overhead light. On one side, a low table held a stack of music magazines, a deck of cards, and a small portable record player already spinning something slow and bluesy. The soft bass line rolled through the air like a heartbeat under conversation. Members of the TCB band were scattered through the cabin, a couple flipping through sheet music, another idly drumming fingers against the armrest in time with the music. At the far end sat the manager, Polk Caldwell, with his ever-present briefcase resting against his leg. Near the galley, he spotted a familiar face, the same flight attendant from the commercial flight weeks ago. She was pouring coffee into a silver carafe, her posture precise, her expression controlled. When her eyes met his, she offered a small smile. It was polite, not mocking this time, but there was still an edge, a quick flicker in her gaze that suggested she hadn't entirely abandoned her earlier impressions. As the engines began their low, steady whine, he took a seat near the front, close enough to the cockpit to catch a glimpse of the crew moving through their pre-flight routine. The music continued its lazy loop, underscored by the soft hum of ventilation. From the other side of the aisle, he caught fragments of a conversation between two members of the crew. It wasn't hostile, not in tone, but there was that almost casual skepticism he'd grown accustomed to hearing. Comments about how much fuel the plane must burn, how the interior could probably pay for a small house, how strange it must be to live in such excess. It wasn't meant to reach his ears, but in the intimacy of the cabin, every word traveled. He didn't turn toward them. His eyes stayed on the record player, watching the slow, hypnotic rotation of the vinyl. Inside, there was a faint pull, not of anger, but of that same recognition he'd had on the commercial flight. The awareness that for some, the man was always swallowed by the image, and the image carried its own price tags, its own judgments. A burst of laughter came from the back, sharper this time. One of the musicians had said something that landed just close enough to the bone. A joke about burning through cash as fast as chords. It wasn't meant cruelly, but it landed in the same place. The flight attendant glanced up at the sound, her mouth curling slightly in a private reaction. He stood without hurry, crossing the aisle with the smooth gait of someone who knew exactly where he was headed. She looked up at him, startled at his sudden presence beside her in the narrow space by the galley. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he drew out a small, cream-colored envelope. It was unmarked, sealed with a neat fold. He extended it toward her without explanation. "Open it when we land," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of intent. For a moment, she simply held it between her fingers, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. He gave a small nod, not of reassurance, but of finality, and stepped back toward his seat. The engine's hum deepened, and the cabin lights softened to a warm glow, as the Lisa Marie began to roll toward the taxiway. The record needle lifted with a faint click, replaced by the muted rumble of the plane gathering speed. Conversations settled into low murmurs, the earlier laughter fading into the background noise. From his seat, he could see her through the curve of the aisle, the envelope now resting on the counter beside the coffee carafe. She glanced at it more than once as she moved through the cabin, pouring drinks and adjusting headsets. Whatever was inside remained a mystery for her and for everyone else on board. He leaned back, one hand draped loosely over the armrest, the other resting against his knee. Outside the window, the runway lights stretched in even rows, guiding them forward into the night. Inside, the air held a quiet tension, not of conflict, but of something unresolved, waiting just beyond the horizon. The wheels touched down with a muted double thud, and the Lisa Marie slowed along the runway, engines dropping from their resonant roar to a low, steady growl. In the cabin, seat belts loosened, jackets were pulled from hooks, and conversation began to swell again. Lighter now, softened by the relief of a smooth arrival, he stayed seated as the jet taxied to its private bay, one leg crossed loosely over the other, gaze turned toward the darkened window. Outside, the terminal lights shimmered on the slick pavement, casting thin silver streaks that broke under the passing silhouettes of ground crew. The envelope was still in her possession. When the engines finally idled and the door swung open to the waiting stairway, the passengers began filing out. She hung back, moving toward the galley, as if to tidy something, though her eyes kept flicking toward him. He stood, collected his jacket without hurry, and stepped aside to let the others pass. By the time the cabin emptied, only she and a pair of crew members remained. She set the coffee carafe back into its holder. Then, with a breath so quiet it barely moved her shoulders, broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a little girl with wide, curious eyes and dark hair tucked behind her ears. Across the bottom, in a hand both steady and deliberate, were the words, "We all play roles. I do it on stage. You do it here. But behind the roles, there's always a person. Sometimes, a kind one." Her fingers lingered on the photo longer than she meant to. She glanced up at him, and for the first time since they'd met, the guarded expression slipped. "I didn't mean to," she began, then stopped, the words collapsing under the weight of the rest. She swallowed, eyes dropping to the picture again. "I grew up watching someone throw away everything we had. My father, he gambled until there was nothing left. When I see people surrounded by things like this," she gestured faintly toward the gold buckles, the polished wood, "I can't help but feel it's all just waste." He listened without interrupting, his posture open but still. There was no impatience in his face, only a quiet attentiveness that allowed her voice to find its way. When she fell silent, he stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the counter beside her. "It's not about the things," he said. "It's about what you can do with them." From the side pocket of his bag, he pulled out a folded navy blue T-shirt, the kind sold only at the tour stops. Across the front, in bold white letters, was the name of the tour. The fabric was covered in signatures, not just his, but every member of the band and crew. "You have a son, don't you?" he asked. Her eyes widened slightly. "I do." "Give this to him," he said, placing it in her hands. "Tell him it's from all of us." Her throat tightened as she accepted the shirt, pressing it briefly to her chest before folding it carefully over her arm. The photograph remained in her other hand, the edges softening under her grip. They stepped out into the cool night air together. The terminal was quieter than the commercial side of the airport, but a small group of waiting staff and ground crew stood near the gate, watching. Word must have traveled ahead of them because as soon as they appeared at the top of the stairs, someone began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, just a few pairs of hands. Then others joined in, and the sound swelled, echoing against the concrete walls of the bay. He didn't pause to bask in it. Instead, he glanced at her, and with a small, almost conspiratorial tilt of his head, began to hum the first lines of Love Me Tender. The crew on the tarmac picked it up first, their voices hesitant at the start. The band members, still lingering at the base of the stairs, added harmony, and soon the song floated into the night air, imperfect but warm. She stood beside him, the shirt tucked under her arm, the photograph still in her hand. Her voice joined the others, thin at first, then steadier, as though the melody gave her permission to stand in that moment without apology. When the last notes faded, there was no formal ending, just a few lingering chords from someone's guitar and the natural drift of conversation returning. He offered her a small, genuine smile before stepping toward the waiting car. Behind him, she looked down at the shirt again, then at the photograph, and knew with sudden clarity that she would keep both. Not because of who had given them, but because of what they had shifted inside her. A reminder that even in the most carefully constructed roles, a simple act could turn an assumption into something closer to respect. The air inside Graceland felt still, almost heavy. Outside, the cicadas droned in the late summer heat, their chorus swelling and falling in waves. But indoors, the room seemed sealed against sound. He had drawn the curtains hours earlier, muting the light until only thin lines of gold leaked in at the edges. The record player in the corner spun at near full volume, old gospel harmonies, layered and raw, filling the quiet with voices that couldn't ask questions. The newspaper lay folded on the coffee table, a headline half visible. Former security aide reveals Presley secrets. He didn't have to read the rest. The story had already made its rounds through phone calls and whispers. The man had been close enough to share meals, to stand in the wings during shows, to know when the smiles were genuine and when they were for the crowd. And now his words were scattered for strangers to dissect, some truths bent until they served a different narrative. He sat in the armchair, one leg drawn up, the heel resting on the cushion. A glass of iced tea sat untouched on the side table, condensation pooling beneath it. The music covered the silence, but it couldn't dull the way the betrayal settled in his chest, cold at the edges. The phone rang. He let it sound twice before picking up. On the other end, a voice he recognized immediately, the captain who had flown him on countless tours. There was no hesitation in the greeting, just a simple, "We've got a run coming up. Same crew as last time. But this time, they asked if you'd be on board." He leaned back, letting the words settle. "They asked?" "They did," the captain confirmed. "Some of them want to say a few things in person. Good things. Thought you should hear it." For a long moment, he didn't answer. The room felt no lighter, but there was a thread of something different there, a small shift in the air. Finally, he said, "All right, I'll be there." 2 days later, he was stepping back onto the Lisa Marie. The late afternoon sun threw long streaks of amber through the cabin windows. The same gold-toned buckles gleamed against the seats. The same polished wood reflected faintly in the glassware stacked in the galley. But the mood felt altered, softer, expectant. The flight attendants greeted him not with the brisk professionalism of routine, but with measured warmth, a kind of quiet respect that carried more weight than any scripted welcome. A few of the band members looked up from their seats, offering nods and small smiles. Once airborne, The captain came out briefly, leaning against the frame of the cockpit door. "They're glad you came," he said. "Wasn't sure you would." He didn't answer right away. The low hum of the engines filled the space between them. Finally, he said, "Sometimes you take the flight, not because you need to get somewhere, but because of who's on board." As the hours stretched, the cabin became a small, self-contained world. The musicians traded stories in the rear section. A couple of crew members moved quietly through their duties, occasionally glancing his way as though gauging whether to approach. Eventually, one did. The same attendant who had once kept her distance. She crouched slightly beside his seat, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I wanted to say, I misjudged you. Before. I see that now." Her voice didn't tremble, but it was softer than he'd heard it before. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "It's all right. People see what they're shown. Takes time to see past that." The rest of the flight passed in a calm rhythm. No sharp words, no undercurrents of judgment. Only the steady pulse of the engines and the occasional laughter from the back. By the time they began their descent, the feeling in the cabin had shifted entirely. It wasn't the false ease of forced politeness. It was the quiet steadiness that comes when distrust gives way to something closer to understanding. As the wheels touched down, he realized the isolation of the past days hadn't vanished, but it had thinned. The walls he'd drawn up around himself still stood, but now there was a door, left slightly ajar. He knew it wouldn't erase the sting of the betrayal waiting in headlines and conversations outside this plane, but here, in this narrow stretch of sky between departure and arrival, he'd felt something he hadn't expected. The solid ground of human connection, even at 30,000 feet. When they rolled to a stop, he stood, slinging his jacket over his shoulder. The captain caught his eye one more time. "See you next run?" "Count on it," he said, and stepped out into the light, the sound of the engines still in his ears like a promise. The afternoon sun hung low over the runway, flattening the colors of the sky into a pale wash. Heat shimmered off the tarmac, making the air above the asphalt waver in slow, ghostly movements. The Lisa Marie stood waiting, her engines silent, her paint catching the light like a polished seashell. Inside, the cabin was alive with the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of gear being stowed, and the occasional clink of glasses in the galley. This was no first run. The seats were already worn to the shape of familiar travelers. The tables bore faint marks from countless coffee cups, and the overhead compartments held the faint smell of fabric warmed by years of flights. The tour, one of his last long stretches, would take them through smaller towns this time. Places where the concert hall doubled as the civic center, where the crowd might drive hours from farms and quiet neighborhoods to see him. He moved through the aisle, nodding here and there, taking in the usual pre-departure energy. Some of the band members were trading jokes at the back. The manager was half buried in paperwork, and a pair of crew members leaned in close over a seating chart. Near the forward section, a young flight steward stood adjusting a panel above one of the seats. His uniform was crisp, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of nerves when they met. "First tour with us?" he asked. The steward nodded. "Yes, sir." Then, almost without pause, he added, "I should say, I never really listened to your music much. Grew up on different stuff. Guess I always thought the legend was bigger than the man." It was the kind of statement most would dress in softer language, but the directness caught his attention. Instead of bristling, he felt an odd ease. "Fair enough," he said. "Do me a favor, then. When you hear me tonight, don't listen for the show. Listen for the person talking through it." The engines stirred to life, the low vibration running through the soles of their shoes. He took his seat, but didn't reach for the magazines or the small talk. Instead, after a moment's thought, he leaned down to the black guitar case resting by his side. The latch clicked softly, and the lid opened to reveal an instrument worn in all the right places. The gloss dulled under the sweep of his forearm, the fretboard smooth where his fingers had pressed countless chords. Without calling attention, he brought it onto his lap, adjusted the strap, and began to play. The notes came quietly at first, weaving into the constant thrum of the engines. It wasn't one of his hits. It wasn't anything the steward, or even the band in the back, had heard from him before. A slow, moody blues, the kind a man played for himself rather than for applause. The music settled into the cabin like warm light. A few of the musicians drifted forward, curious, leaning against the backs of seats to listen. The steward, caught between duties, stood near the aisle, his head tilted slightly as the melody unfolded. There was no performance in his posture, no dramatic tilt of the head or exaggerated strum. His voice, when it came, was low and unforced, the words carrying stories too private for the stage. The guitar's tone blended with the steady drone of the plane, as if the two sounds had been meant to share the same space all along. Minutes passed, unnoticed. The steward's expression shifted, the guarded neutrality giving way to something closer to focus, then to a kind of quiet recognition. The others didn't speak, not wanting to break the moment. When the last chord faded, he rested his palm on the strings, letting the silence close over it. He set the guitar back into its case with the care of someone returning a keepsake to its place. No one clapped. It didn't need that. The steward gave a small nod. "I get what you meant now," he said softly. He smiled, faint and genuine. "Good. That's all I wanted." Outside, the sky beyond the windows deepened into a richer blue, the sunlight thinning as they climbed. Inside, the air felt changed, not dramatically, but enough that those who had been there would remember it long after the flight ended. The Civic Center smelled faintly of fresh paint and popcorn, the kind of scent that clung to small-town arenas long after the crowd had filed in. Folding chairs filled the floor in neat, uneven rows, their metal frames clinking as people settled into them. The stage, only a few feet higher than the front row, was framed in plain black curtains. No towering light rigs, no elaborate backdrops, just a narrow runway of space where music would meet faces without distance. Backstage, he could hear the restless hum of the audience, coughs, shifting feet, the occasional cheer when someone thought they saw movement behind the curtains. He adjusted the mic stand himself, preferring the feel of it under his hands before the show began. His jacket was heavier than he liked in the summer heat, but tonight he wanted the familiar weight across his shoulders. The house lights dimmed. A soft wave of sound swept the room, not the roar of an arena, but the collective inhale of hundreds leaning forward. He stepped out, and the first chords rang, the band sliding in behind him. The music filled the space, warm and immediate, bouncing off the low ceiling and pulling the crowd closer with each verse. Halfway through the set, he spotted her. She was in the front row, a few seats from center, wearing a simple blouse the color of pale wheat. Beside her sat a boy of maybe 10, dark hair falling across his forehead, clutching something against his chest. Even in the dim light, he recognized the faded navy fabric, the tour shirt he'd signed, now softened by countless washes. She met his gaze without hesitation. There was no awkwardness, no lingering defensiveness from their earlier encounters, only the calm recognition of someone who had traveled a distance far beyond miles to be here. The boy, catching the direction of his mother's attention, looked up at him with wide eyes. The next verse slipped away under the weight of the moment. He let the band ride the chord progression a little longer, then lifted his hand to signal them down. The music thinned to a soft hum of bass and cymbals. "Folks," he said into the mic, his voice steady but quiet enough to make the room lean in, "sometimes we take the long way around to find out we're already where we ought to be." He extended a hand toward the pair in the front row. The boy looked to his mother, who gave a small nod. Together they stepped onto the low stage, their movements hesitant at first, then steadier as the crowd broke into applause. Standing with them under the lights, he didn't speak to the audience right away. He bent slightly toward the boy, saying something only the two of them could hear, and the boy's grip on the shirt loosened into an easy hold. Then, turning back to the mic, he let the room see them, not as a staged moment, but as an acknowledgement of a shared history that had begun in an airport and crossed unspoken boundaries since. The applause swelled again, but this time it wasn't just for him. It was for the scene itself, the simple act of closing a circle in public, of letting reconciliation stand where misunderstanding once had. The band eased into "Love Me Tender," the melody stretching gently through the hall. He sang the first lines softly, letting their voices carry in the spaces between. The boy smiled shyly. The woman's eyes shone in the stage light. Around them, strangers swayed slightly in their seats, caught in a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. When the song ended, there was no grand bow, no dramatics. He guided them gently back to the front row, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder as they stepped down. Returning to the mic, he looked out over the audience. The next song waited on the set list, but for a few heartbeats, he let the silence stretch. That rare kind of silence filled not with impatience, but with the sense that something meaningful had just passed among them. Then the band struck up the opening of the next number, and the energy shifted back to the familiar pulse of a show. But for those in the room, the moment stayed, tucked between verses and refrains, impossible to forget. The night air on the tarmac was cooler than the hall had been, a gentle relief after the weight of stage lights and applause. The Lisa Marie waited in a pool of amber light, her polished surface mirroring the runway lamps in stretched, trembling lines. Crew members moved in quiet efficiency, voices low, as if instinctively matching the calm that had settled over the group. Inside the cabin, the mood was different from earlier flights. The usual post-show chatter had softened into something slower, more reflective. Jackets were draped loosely over seats, shoes slipped off under tables. The hum of the ventilation was the loudest constant, mingling with the muted clink of ice settling in glasses. He took his usual place near the forward section, but this time he didn't reach for anything. No guitar, no drink. He simply sat, jacket still on, looking out the window at the dark beyond the airport perimeter. The lights thinned quickly there, giving way to the deep, unbroken black of open country. A shadow moved in the aisle. It was the young steward from the earlier flight, the one who had admitted he'd never been a fan. He stopped beside the seat, one hand resting lightly on the back of it. "I wanted to tell you something before we land back in Memphis," he said, his voice pitched low enough not to carry. "I think I get it now. I mean, I'm a fan, but not for the music. Not anymore. It's because you're not pretending to be a person. You just are one." The words hung there for a moment, simple and unadorned. He met the young man's gaze, and instead of answering right away, he let the silence give them weight. Finally, he offered a small smile, not of pride, but of acknowledgement. "Songs end," he said, "but the way we treat each other, that plays longer than any music." The steward nodded once, then moved on, leaving him alone with the darkened glass. The engines rose to full power, the familiar vibration running through the floor and into the soles of his boots. The runway lights flicked past in quick succession, and then they were lifting. The ground falling away, the black sky swallowing the small lights below. From this height, there was no sign of the Civic Center, no trace of the people still filtering out into the parking lot, carrying their ticket stubs and their memories. Only the faint glow of towns far off in the distance, scattered like embers across the land. The cabin lights were dimmed for the flight. A small pool of warm light from the overhead lamp touched the side of his face, catching the edge of his cheekbone, leaving the rest in shadow. Outside, nothing but the vast unlit sky pressed against the window. For a long time, he sat without moving, listening to the steady, unwavering tone of the engines. It was a sound without beginning or end, as constant as breathing. The others around him shifted in their seats, some dozing, some watching the clouds pass below in faint silver from the moonlight. There were no cameras here, no questions waiting to be answered, no stage to walk onto. Only the quiet truth that tonight's moments, the boy with the shirt, the voice of a man who had once doubted him, would last in ways that no record sales or headlines could measure. He leaned his head lightly against the side of the seat, eyes half closed, not in exhaustion but in the kind of rest that comes when something has been set right. Outside, the darkness stretched on, unbroken, carrying them forward. The Lisa Marie flew steady into the night, and the sound of her engines merged with the silence inside him, the two blending into something that felt less like travel and more like a kind of arrival.